Welcome to Anthology. I'm very pleased to be able to introduce Barbara Moore tonight, who is a writer, an art historian, and the director and curator of the Peter Moore Archive, whose photographs and slides we'll be seeing tonight. I looked back at our calendars today in preparation for this, and this is the fifth time since 2012 that we've had Barbara here at Anthology to give an illustrated lecture and show these slides. So the first one we had Barbara did a talk about the Judson Dance Theater, and then we had a Fluxus lecture. One on Stockhausen happening, and then Barbara was last here, almost exactly a year ago, and did a talk about the avant-garde of the 60s. That was in collaboration with a citywide celebration of the 1960s. So I think lots of those threads will continue in the lecture tonight, but the important thing tonight is, the special thing tonight is that these are color slides by Peter Moore, so it's a special treat. And of course we are presenting them on actual slides, so this is an analog presentation, so this is just a really special event all around. Barbara has said that she's open to answer questions at the end, so save your questions for the end. This is being recorded, so I just ask that if you ask a question, to please speak loud enough so that we can get it on the tape and so that Barbara can hear you. And with that, please welcome Barbara Moore.
Thank you, everybody. Hello, and it's nice to see so many familiar faces. I first want to give thanks to my friends at Anthology. This has been a very special home for me. And John, who just introduced me, Colby, Jed, who's not here, and our projectionist, Genevieve, is up in the booth. Anyway, not too many years ago, I attended a museum lecture by a well-known performance artist who had been active primarily in the 1960s and 70s. During the Q&A, a young woman in the audience asked, "Why are your photographs all in black and white? Why aren't they in color?" In case any of you who've been to my previous lectures have been wondering the same thing, the answer is a combination of the era's technology, societal and cultural attitudes, and processing that was much more expensive, so basically money was an issue. From the photographer's perspective, it was the color, film, and processing being so much more expensive. From the publisher's point of view, printing was likewise. And in books, if color was used at all, plates were either bunched together in their own separate section of the book or were individually hand-tipped onto pages. And from the art audience's, basically the art consumer's standpoint, color in photography was considered simply tacky for many, many years. In addition, according to Peter, it was difficult for him to shoot black and white and color at the same event. Not only extra equipment was involved, but shifting back and forth could get confusing because one visualized the results so differently. The fact that there's so little color in his archive means that there's not the continuity of his black and white. And as you know, if you've been here before, I usually proceed chronologically, which if you're dealing with one issue like dance or fluxus or happenings or some other genre, that continuity gives you a very good picture of how things developed. There's no special theme to tonight's lecture. I've still organized it chronologically, which creates a lot of sort of jarring juxtapositions of genres. And actually, I like that. We're going to be going from very primitive uses of technology to very advanced issues of technology, from elaborate formats and ways of thinking about art to very minimalist, from structured to improvisatory, and these will be adjacent to each other and will actually give you a very good idea, in this case, of the really incredible variety of things Peter and I were exposed to in short spaces of time. So even among these different approaches to art making, several themes emerge. There'll be the uses of technology and new materials, psychedelia, multimedia, site-specific installations you'll see a lot of, and performances with audience participation. You, Y-O-U, 1964 by the German artist Wolf Wastel. Wastel calls his happenings and other artworks décollages, as distinct from the word collage, which he called them acts of reduction and mutation. He provided a brief descriptive scenario, allowed no spectators, only participants, and encouraged things to happen. About this method of creating happenings, Alan Capro had said, both some degree of control and some amount of risk are parts of the experience. The happening You took place in a swimming pool and on the tennis court of an estate on Long Island. The actions, particularly a water gun fight with colored water taking place in the white swimming pool that you see here, clearly dictated color photography. There was a woman in gauze on a trampoline. Wastel claimed that the first happening he'd witnessed had been an air raid and that his theory of décollage destruction art was inspired by his wartime experiences. The finale of You consisted of a burning TV and red flares with participants in gas masks. An influential figure behind expanding interest by artists in using technology was the Bell Labs engineer Billy Kluver, who in 1966 became a founding principal of Experiments in Art and Technology, which is formally known as EAT or EAT. EAT encouraged artists to use technology in transforming space and materials beyond canvas and static sculpture. Not only was there a surge of new technologies, but the existing ones became cheaper and more portable, particularly video. This availability, plus the atmosphere of experimentation and receptiveness to sensual and mind-altering stimuli, produced a deluge of multimedia performances. Kluver was a frequent advisor to artists on the technical aspects of their work. He worked with Jasper Johns, Robert Rauschenberg, and of course a lot of the dancers of Judson Dance Theater. There was a whole series of events called 9 Evenings Theater and Engineering, which I'm not going to get into, even though there is color from them. This is obviously him with Andy Warhol, and he was an advisor on the helium-filled mylar pillows that Warhol made. Steve Paxton is familiar to most of you as a dancer, particularly as a founder of Judson Dance Theater and an innovator of contact improvisation. These photographs are from a period in the mid-1960s when he experimented with inflatable, transparent plastic props and structures. Here, Steve and Robert Rauschenberg are in a tunnel installed in Rauschenberg's studio. This is Lamont Young and Marianne Cecilia, who for more than 50 years, during more than 50 years of collaboration, have been very consistent in integrating light and sound as a concept. The intricacies of Marion's calligraphic patterns and sumptuous lighting are visual analogies to Lamont's dense wall of sound that, although often referred to as minimalist, is full of its own mesmerizing convolutions. As with many of the works I'll be showing, Alan Capro's are about place. Capro once said art is, quote, a handshake between the artist and nature, unquote, in which the artist can choose the degree of alteration and transformation. In August 1966, he and sculptor Charles Fraser staged a 3-day event throughout the Hamptons, for which the overall title was Gas. The first morning, there was a balloon and oil drum parade in Southampton, complete with costumed characters on Fraser's hovercrafts. That afternoon, everybody went to Amagansett Beach, where Fraser, who's in this picture, erected a huge phallus-like inflated skyscraper. The second day took place on the rocky beach under Montauk Bluffs. Firefighting foam cascaded over the bluffs, the artificial foam meeting the foam of the sea, as participants, shrieking like seagulls, followed Capro, here in the blue shirt in the center, through the froth. On the third day, we assembled at the Springs, in the dump area, where there were additional actions involving foam and plastic-shrouded figures. Alison Knowles's The Big Book was a large sculptural installation about 8 or 9 feet high, with a pole for a central spine, around which the hinged pages could be opened. There were rooms with distinct functions, such as the kitchen, which is here, and passageways one could call through. And this is another aspect of 2 of the pages. In an era that was still fairly bare bones in respect to technology, artists accomplished a lot with simple analog means. This is Otto Pina. His proliferation of the sun consisted of color slides being projected at enormous size to envelop viewers. I'm not going to offer any depth into Charlotte Moorman and her 15 annual New York Avant-Garde festivals, because I've already covered those so extensively over the last few years. But here is one small sample. At the 5th Festival, 1967, which took place for 24 hours on a Staten Island ferryboat, to the surprise of commuters and tourists, the Japanese Fluxus artist Ayo made a rainbow streamer that flowed from a human Lady Liberty. As the 1960s progressed, enveloping immersive multimedia environments became more and more common. USCO was a communal group of psychedelic artists based in Gardnerville, New York, and this is the 2 founders, Gerd Stern and Michael Callahan, in the tabernacle they built in an abandoned church in 1968. And this is a strobe light installation called Fan Flash Stick that was in a New York warehouse also in '68. This is Merce Cunningham's Walk Around Time at BAM in the same year. It has Jesper Johns' translations of Duchamp's large glass made into inflatable scenic elements. Plains was the first of what Tricia Brown called her equipment dances, in which dancers work against gravity with the aid of a structure or support system, the equipment, that allows them to give the illusion that gravity doesn't exist. 3 performers, Tricia, Simone Forti, and Michelle Friedman, in this performance, which was among the first two performances in '68. Three performers move along the surface of a pegboard-like wall. Their costumes are black on one side, white on the other, so that sometimes they're part of the projected image of the film, which is filmed by Judd Yalcott, and sometimes blocking those images. The title planes can be understood in two ways: as the flat surface being performed on, and in reference to the filmed images, which were all taken from airplanes. This combination of the planar with the aerial imagery and the performer's anti-gravitational poses was, and still is when this piece is performed, very disorienting. As Charlotte Moorman had discovered for her avant-garde festivals, urban spaces are perfect settings for unusual and dramatic site-specific installations. In 1968, James Lee Byers created a mile-long walkway of red fabric stretching from 59th to 79th Streets on Fifth Avenue. Earlier, Byers had called Peter to alert him that he would be arriving in a yellow taxi, which he did. Back then, taxis didn't have to be yellow as they are now, and color was clearly important to this piece, a definite invitation for Peter to shoot it in that way. And I remember Byers was a little bit late, and he said he had trouble getting a yellow cab. They were all other colors that were accessible to him at first. Filmmaker Stan Vanderbeek was an early proponent of multimedia. He built a private domed theater called the Movie Drome next to his house upstate. And this is Stan in the interior. There's been a symbiotic relationship between art and poetry going back at least to Apollinaire, and a more recent love fest between art and fashion. In 1969, fashion, art, and poetry came together in the fashion show Poetry event, for which artists designed imaginative outfits that were paired with witty and acerbic descriptions written by the poets John Perrault, Hannah Wiener, and Eduardo Costa. It took place at the Center for Inter-American Relations, now known as the America Society, an elegant mansion at 68th Street and Park Avenue. As you can see, the audience was stylistically as well as geographically far from downtown. This is one of the photographed events that I always have serious trouble editing. There's so much terrific material to choose from. Here's just a tip of the iceberg sampling. This is France Race wearing Enrique Castro Sid's balloon-like gown. Gerard Malanga wore Andy Warhol's plastic bustier under a leather jacket. Joy Bang wore a plastic tendril creation by Les Levine. And I'm sorry, I didn't have time to look this one up. I'm not familiar off the top of my head with who that artist was that created that outfit. Carolee Schneemann wore only a blindfold, white high heels, and a tape deck, playing a description of her outfit, for which the artist, Klaus Oldenburg, had instructed, the poets will provide her clothes. The finale was a multi-person hat by James Lee Byers for the audience, accompanied by the lines, group therapy, group living, and now group clothing. And by the way, that looks like John Ashbery on the left. I think that's him there. One of the most glorious multimedia pieces Peter ever photographed was a concert by Terry Riley and David Rosenboom, with projections by the light artist Pablo at the Electric Circus in 1969. This was another of the hardest subjects from which to edit slides, because Peter shot so much in luscious color, and it's fortunate that the transparencies remain so vivid after 50 years. Now you see, we're going from some of those dramatic contrasts and juxtapositions that I mentioned to you. Within the same period, this piece by Deborah Hay took place in Damrush Park, and it's the exact opposite of all that elaborate technology. This is Damrush Park next to Lincoln Center in 1969. The park's configuration has changed considerably since then, as you're probably aware. Deborah Hay, at the time, was creating very schematic, minimal works, often for very large groups of people, not all of them trained as dancers. The performers wore street clothes, the movements were casual, but structured, often in geometric configurations. I'm going to make a long digression right now on Meredith Monk's work. Peter had begun his archive in the spirit of a classic Life magazine-style photo essay, which encouraged in-depth attention to all aspects of its subject. He was also naturally a social person and enjoyed continuing interaction with artists he documented from their beginnings and his own beginnings. This dedicated interchange adds tremendously to the archive's richness and is very important and noticeable, particularly in the black and white, which has such continuity itself. But Meredith's work is an exceptional example of this comprehensive approach. Peter photographed her earliest performances in the mid-1960s and continued in both black and white and color up until a year or so before his death in 1993. His photographs track her development from dancer under the postmodern Judson influence to the creation of huge, highly visual, multi-sided spectacles, and thus also Peter's extensive use of color. And then on to spectacles that more and more incorporated music, with her becoming best known as a composer and musical performer. One of her first and grandest large-scale creations was Juice, which she referred to as a theater cantata. It was in 3 sections on 3 different days in November and December 1969. Part 1 was the first performance ever allowed in the rotunda of the Guggenheim Museum, which Meredith used to great dramatic effect. Now I'm going to show you 2 black and white photographs. This is where the gaps in color, they need sometimes the part of the story that's missing, which I may only have in black and white. So this evening at the Guggenheim was in 3 parts. First, with the audience on the ground floor of the atrium, looking up at humming performers on the spiraling ramp. There were also 4 red-painted figures, which I'm not going to show you in this sequence, because they'll come up later again. And I don't have them in red at this point, including Monk herself clutching each other as they went clumping up the ramp. Next, with both audience and performers together on the ramp, and the audience free to wander between several simultaneous events, juxtaposed with the Roy Lichtenstein exhibition that was on the walls at the time. And then the third part was the audience was on top and the performers were down on the ground floor. And this is the other black and white, obviously. Then 3 weeks after the Guggenheim, part 2 took place in a small theater on the Upper West Side. repeating some of the same oral, visual, and kinetic elements, but in a vastly differing context. On a modest proscenium stage, the focus was more intently on the four red people who had appeared at the Guggenheim. And from the left, they're Madeline Lloyd, Daniel Ira Sverdlik, Meredith, and Dick Higgins. Their redness was sometimes intensified by red lighting, and at times they trudged across the stage in the same clasped together posture they had used on the Guggenheim ramp. A week later, we gathered for part 3 in Monk's Loft in Soho. Props and costumes from the other sections were exhibited, and the red people in their real-life selves appeared on video, discussing their roles. As the scale of juice shifted from the soaring Guggenheim interior to the modest proscenium stage to the loft setting, the audience-performer relationship kept shifting along with the spatial changes. One of my favorites of Meredith's complex early works is also the least known. Needlebrain Lloyd and the Systems Kid, which Meredith called a live movie, took place at the American Dance Festival in 1970, when the festival was still at Connecticut College in New London. Scenes ran from 4 o'clock in the afternoon until evening, into the evening, in the Arboretum and on the college green, with a break for dinner. Peter's photographs capture the episodic, non-narrative character and atmosphere so closely tied to Meredith's choice of performance location. In Needlebrain, we once again see 4 red people, but in totally different circumstances. At this stage in her career, Meredith was somehow creating such huge extravaganzas roughly once a year, in addition to smaller works and films. Juice had 85 performers, Needlebrain 150. Her language followed suit. She called Vessel in 1971 an opera epic. Her theme and her subject was Joan of Arc, and it was a very poetic, mythic evocation of time and space. This is Meredith as Joan, Bill Dunas, the dancer, Daniel Sverdlik, Lanny Harrison, Blondell Cummings, and Monica Mosley and Daniel Sverdlik again. And most of these performers became virtually a Monk repertory company. We're now up to 1973 in Meredith's work, Education of the Girl Child, which had an all-female cast. Sally Baines referred to the women as a strange tribe of women. It suggests a feminist theme, but the treatment was more evocative than stridently political. We have a lot of the people from her repertory company here, Blondell Cummings, on the left, Coco Picalis, Lanny Harrison, Monica Mosley, and Lee Negrin at the table, and there's Meredith herself. This is Lanny and Meredith. One of the most extraordinary sequences Meredith has ever created was a solo in Education of the Girl Child, in which she traveled down a white canvas path, progressing from old age to youth by discarding her wig, letting her hair down, and changing her posture and voice. The Grand Union was an improvisatory collective active from 1970 to 1976. The group played off exceptional synergy between remarkable performers, most of whom had known each other since Judson Dance Theater in the early 1960s. That's Yvonne Rayner, Steve Paxton with his back to us, and Barbara Dilley. This is another group photo. This is Yvonne wearing Kleenex box shoes. Now, around this time, it had been publicized that the eccentric millionaire Howard Hughes, who was very germophobic, had used Kleenex boxes for shoes, and Yvonne had incorporated that into her improvisation with the Grand Union at this point. And that's Steve again. The most famous personality in the so-called theater of images has been Robert Wilson. One of his early pieces was Deaf Man Glance in 1971. It was at BAM. And here it is in both a final rehearsal and a performance. Yoko Ono had a long association with Fluxus from the time she came to New York in the early 60s until she left for Europe in 1966, where, of course, she met John Lennon. John and Yoko came back to the States in 1971, and shortly thereafter she recorded her second solo album, Fly, and this is in the studio. Anna Halprin, who was a huge influence on the Judson dancers in California, she didn't actually come to New York until about 1967, I think was the first time. This is a performance in 1971 called Transformations and Initiations. And that's Anna in the dotted shirt there. This is Steve Reich at MoMA in 1971. While Americans were developing their own anti-establishment happenings in the 1960s, similar movements were percolating in Europe, often with more turbulent or outrageous actions in reaction to those countries' experiences in war, such as I mentioned with Vostell's You, and also against the rigid societies and bourgeois societies that were over there. A particularly transgressive group was the Viennese Action Group in Vienna, one of whose founders, Hermann Nietzsche, created what he called orgies, mysteries, theater. Nietzsche's complex work combines the religious and the pagan, ritually reminding us that the crucifixion was in actuality a gruesome event. In witnessing his shocking performances, it helps to remember that similar imagery appears frequently throughout art history in works such as Grunewald's Eisenheim Walterpiece, and there's a Titian painting of the flaying of Marsyas, and many others, St. Bartholomew and whatever. Nietzsche's first large-scale performance in New York was in 1972 at the original site of the Kitchen Alternative Space, which was really in the kitchen of the old Broadway Central Hotel in Soho. And before you get at me for showing a nude woman in a vulnerable position within a bloody setting, here's proof that Nietzsche's shock tactics also applied to naked men. This is Hermann Nietzsche a few years later in 1980. And this is a more warehouse-like ambiance it was a very short-lived art fair, I don't even remember the name of it, where they thought they'd give some excitement to it and had him doing a performance. But the audience was equally enthralled, even though it was very far from the usual happenings audience. When working chronologically in Peter's files, occasionally weird trends pop up. But backtracking to the early 70s, we're suddenly finding a lot of food-related art. And to go from niche to what I'm going to show you is just, the total opposite. Anthony Miralda created elaborate feasts of brightly colored food over a number of years at that time. Here is a 1972 collaboration with Dorothy Sells. It's an elaborate landscape made out of chocolate and brightly colored foods, as you can see. And then for Easter Sunday in 1973, Charlotte Moorman was covered in chocolate and coconut flakes to perform Jim McWilliams' The Ultimate Easter Bunny, which is also known as Candy, at the Clock Tower. This is an iconic use of the urban landscape. It's Tricia Brown's roof piece. We're looking south from the roof of 80 Worcester Street at 12 or 15 dancers on rooftops extending to about Chambers Street. They're forming a relay of large, simple movements from one dancer to the next, first going south, then back again, trying to keep the movement as close to the original as possible. If you were looking at this picture with a real magnifying glass, you could probably see 6 dancers. I don't see it now myself, but I've examined it under other circumstances very closely. And the last one is a small red dot to the left of the last water tower, is the way I've made a note of it. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, Charlotte continued organizing her annual New York avant-garde festivals, and she never ran out of ideas for new festival locations. With her unbeatable mix of Southern belle demeanor and steely determination, she usually got whatever permits were necessary. One of her most brilliant coups was getting Grand Central Station for the 10th festival in 1973. Individual artists set up installations or performed in a string of boxcars sitting on the tracks. In one, John Cage, shown here, worked on his empty words using chance procedures as applied to Thoreau's journals. In another car, Jeff Hendricks performed Sky Roots, a meditation on dreams in a beautiful setting of branches. And Stephen Vargel wore one of his wonderful costumes made out of quotidian materials. In this case, string and cardboard slide mounts, such as the ones I'm using for this lecture. Fluxus leader George Maciunas delighted in producing themed events consisting of many short works by different artists organized around a common subject. One such concert was the Time concert that took place at the Clock Tower Gallery in Tribeca in 1976. This is Larry Miller installing his piece, Winding for Lower Manhattan and Taking a Bow. Now, actually, this title can be pronounced 2 ways, either as winding relating to the clock function, or winding referring to the fan blade. Robert Whitman has always preferred to call his works theater pieces rather than happenings. Others sometimes use the term theater of images. This is The American Moon, a work from 1960, but in a 1976 revival. The audience surrounded the action, and in one sequence, a huge polyethylene balloon filled the center space with figures within and under it. As a founding member of the influential Czech performance group Aktuál in the 1960s, Milan Knížek had been in correspondence with Alan Capro and George Maciunas. In 1968, during Prague Spring, he came to the United States under Maciunas' sponsorship and participated in Fluxus and numerous other art events. overstaying his visa when the Russians invaded what was then Czechoslovakia. Homesick despite this, he returned home in 1970, only to be subjected to suppressive communist standards and jailed for what the authorities considered pornography. Although a worldwide campaign by Amnesty International helped secure his release, Milan wasn't allowed to hold any job other than that of a gatekeeper on one of Prague's beautiful old bridges. So privately, he became a restorer of puppets, captured here by Peter in 1976. Ultimately, after democracy was restored to the Czech Republic, he was installed by the artist as director of the Academy of Fine Arts. This is Robert Wilson and Phil Glass's Einstein on the Beach, the original 1976 performance, and the 1984 revival, both at the Metropolitan Opera House. That's Cheryl Sutton and Lucinda Childs. That's Lucinda, and that's Lucinda again on the right. Jack Smith was certainly colorful in his work, but the only photograph I'm going to show is this portrait in performance from 1976. That's one of my favorites. There was a period when the landfill that later became Battery Park City was something called Art on the Beach, sponsored by Creative Time. And this is Simone Forti in 1978 performing there. Once again, a coming together of art and outrageous fashion in an exhibition and performance by Louise Bourgeois in 1978. In the late 1970s, as the various types of performance began being lumped together as performance art, a conscious use of entertainment values crept into the mix. The Kipper kids, who brought grossness, body art, and food together, exemplified this. This is Deborah Hay at Paula Cooper Gallery in '79. This is Peter Schumann baking bread. Now, Peter Moore photographed Peter Schumann beginning with his first performance at Judson Memorial Church in 1962. And then, as with Meredith Monk, continuing the documentation for 3 decades. Schumann had originally called his company the People Puppet Theater, but when his offering the audience homemade bread became a tradition, it was renamed Bread and Puppet Theater. There are thousands of photographs, and it's a disservice to both of the Peter's work that I'm not able to show more. I've just selected 4 here because of time constraints mostly. There are 4 that are from the circus and pageant that Peter Schumann and Bread and Puppet do in Vermont every year. There's a sad story about the next group of slides, which are of Squat Theater's Andy Warhol's Last Love, taken in 1982. Squat had a storefront on 23rd Street, and atypically, Peter and I attended the production 3 times because you could see it from the outside of the window that was on the street or from the inside. And I was writing an article centered on it, for which I selected Peter's best photographs and the ones that made the most coherent narrative. These chosen slides were then lost when I put them into supposedly secure storage that wasn't secure. I was very distraught and unable to do the project I planned, and the rest of the photographs lay undisturbed until recently. So my memory is hazy. I haven't had a chance to do research, and I can't tell you details of the performance. This is from the outside. You can see on the left a guy is looking in. This is out on the street, and it was raining that night. There was a fire element out on the street. You can see this is at the curb. That's where the fire is. One thing I do remember vividly is that the performance ended with a huge screen of silver mylar descending from the ceiling to face the audience, so that they were eerily reflected in its distorted surface. Now you can see how just looked at these recently for the first time in like 40 years or whatever it is, more, and I had not remembered the images themselves, and I just flipped out here because the only face that's visible in that is Peter doing his self-portrait. If you look at right towards where that line is in the mylar, and you see a guy with a fairly legible face, and he's clutching his camera, that's Peter. Even though so many of the best photographs were lost, this was a wonderful surprise, and that's the way I'm going to end the lecture.
Any questions?
That person Pablo who did the projections with Terry Riley, who was that?
I'm sorry?
The person Pablo, I think you said, who did projections?
Pablo Light Show was a very one of the very
Pablo
famous
Light Show.
shows.
That's the name of the group. The group is called Pablo. You're saying?
That I don't know.
Okay. I don't know who
There was
that is.
one person named Pablo.
Oh, it's okay. No.
I don't remember his full name. I used to know his full name, but he was one of those iconic 60s.
From New York or
Light
from
show.
West Coast?
Well, he was in clubs and stuff.
Oh,
I
okay.
I think that was the only time we ever saw his work. Any other questions? No?
Just what, if you had to guess, percentage-wise, how much is color versus black and white in the archive?
There's maybe, we made a rough estimate, and I think it's a very rough estimate, and it's underestimated, but we estimated 5,000 or 6,000 slides. But there's, well, the whole archive is about 500,000 negatives and slides, of which a third to a half is performance. I mean, it's not all, but that's Peter's life's work. And of course, there's color that's part of his personal work too, which I haven't really counted and been into at all, but it's a very small percentage. And there are these huge gaps, so it's hard. As you could see, there was no storyline here, except a very general one, which did crop up where you could see the varieties of work that were being done over long periods still. But then there'll be gaps of several years where there's nothing. Whereas the black and white goes continuously.
Barbara, what's the emotion that you have as you present all this? 20 years of work that's incredibly powerful and not here anymore.
First of all, I can look at most of it very dispassionately now, but I'm getting back to writing a book that's been on hold for several years, and I find it very easy to talk about the events. It's very hard to talk about myself, in terms of one of the things I want to bring out in the book is what it was like for us to personally experience these things when they were new, and that's when I get into trouble.
Yeah.
And the only thing was that discovering this picture of Peter in the squat stuff was really emotional. That particular thing, because first of all, so much of that shoot was lost, and that one of the things that was saved, and of course there may have been an even better picture. I think that's quite a wonderful picture on its own. And then this face just jumped out at me. Did you all see it? You must have seen it, because it was the only legible face in that picture. And if you knew Peter, you would have recognized him.
Do you have a diary or a calendar of these events as they went along? Did you keep a diary or sort of a calendar?
We kept a calendar diary, yes, but it's sometimes ambiguous and vague, because we would say we were going to see a performer, but we didn't have the name of the performance. But then in the archive, I have all the programs. I kept all the programs, and that's how we've identified things through the years. Because as I tell people, when we started doing this, we didn't know the names of the people. It wasn't like you were going to see a famous person. That person might be famous now, and you're going to remember who is Yvonne Rainer or somebody. But back then, we didn't know Yvonne from another female dancer. And so the only way to keep track of it was that I took all the programs, and they're interleaved in the archive. And by the way, you know, as some of you know this, the archive is going to Northwestern University and will be fully there by the end of 2020. But it doesn't include prints, it's only the master set of contacts, the original negatives, the transparencies, and the information that goes with them.
Barbara, Peter was obviously very talented with color, but as you mentioned at the very beginning, at that time, especially in the early years, color was regarded as kitsch. Did he sort of buy color film, expense to one side? Did he buy the slide film reluctantly and sort of with a sense of embarrassment? Or was he sort of excited about shooting color film?
Well, he obviously got excited by some things. But as you could see, the first thing I could locate in performance, and one of the early things even would, I don't even know how much really, really early stuff there is before that in his personal work. You know, it was about 1964. And you know, there's another thing about Peter's archive that's interesting about what it cost us to maintain it, and the reason we could do this. Peter, we totally did this on our own. Peter taking the pictures, and Peter and I together making the archive out of it. And we were always holding other jobs and things to make money. But Peter was the official press photographer for the new school from the mid-60s to about the mid-70s. And the head of public relations who had hired him, he was on a retainer. It was like a couple $100 a month. It was, even though that's more than it would be, it would be more today than it was then. It wasn't very much, and he was on call, basically, for whenever they needed him. And the head of the public relations department who had hired him opened an account for him and told Peter very explicitly, use it, which was very clear. When Michael Cohn was talking the other day, and he was saying that Trump spoke in a code about what you were supposed to do. It was like, it was very clearly meant, Peter told me, that he should use it, which really most of I think all of the film and paper that Peter used in those years was on the New School account. They never counted how many rolls of film. Now, I doubt, he never shot color for the New School, so I don't know. I can't speak for that. But that was what kept us going for so long. Yes?
Hi Barbara, how are you?
Hi,
Thank you so
yes.
much. At what point along the way, as Peter was documenting performances, did there start to be a relationship between the performers or the choreographers and you all, and the work and the pictures?
Oh, I thought you were gonna ask a relationship in another way, okay.
Well, you can answer that, too. I'm interested
Well,
in
no,
that.
because some things I'm developing, one theme I'm developing in my book is the changing relationship of photographers to performance.
Yeah.
But I won't get into that now. Well, the circle we were closest to was the Fluxus circle, in terms of having close friends. We were very friendly with most of the other people, but not in the same social circles. So we weren't party people either. So, well, we went to certain number of parties, obviously, but we certainly got to know a lot of people. And the interesting thing is that in recent years, I've become closer to a lot of the performers as people have appreciated more and more that this stuff exists and is taken care of and whatever. So, but in terms of close friendships, it was the Fluxus group.
Did they see the pictures as they were at the time, contemporary?
Yes, mostly they did. And in later years, that sort of fell off because people got dispersed, or we were out of touch, and there was no way, considering the volume of stuff, that we could have consistently kept that up, particularly not having the money to do it. So it was unfortunately, it was shooting it to preserve it, but that didn't always mean it got seen. And that's why there's so much that hasn't been seen, and I've been spending the last 23 years trying to ferret some of it out. But
Back in the 1960s or so, how did you find out about these things? How did you know, oh, we got to go to this place?
mail and phone and word of mouth.
No
There was no
internet.
internet. Well, first of all, any of you who are in the art world, there's a lot of interest in ephemera now. I mean, there were mailings. Once you got it, Peter and I, our first collaboration, which was nothing to brag about, because it didn't turn out the way it was supposed to, but it was an article on Judson in totality, not just about the art. And it was for Mademoiselle magazine, of all places. And it changed editors in the middle, and the new editor wasn't very interested in the idea, and they sort of butchered it, and it came out to be a big nothing. But basically, if you got on you've probably heard 100 times how much smaller the art world was then than it is now. And everybody knew everybody, and you all went to the same things. So if you were on one mailing list, you got on all the other mailing lists. And the fact that I had kept track of all those pieces of paper and the programs was actually what led me to become a rare book dealer dealing with that stuff, well, not to sell my own collection, but because there were so few people who knew what anything was at that time. And my reference files, as Tara knows, my reference file that holds all those pieces of paper are in the Whitney Museum Library. When Tara was running that library is here. And that's where I'm writing my book. So I have access to my own files.
I mean, you're chronicling a very tumultuous time. Is there any?
I can't hear you very well.
Yeah,
sorry.
yeah, obviously you're chronicling a very tumultuous and fast-moving time. What about the role of autobiography in terms of your own experience as all this is going on? Is there any of that?
I'm not interested in an autobiography in that sense, but one of the things in my book is a memoir of experiencing these things as they were new, and that's what I was saying before,
Yeah.
which is the hardest part for me to write. I can write the facts about all the performances very easily and impartially and whatever, but then it's harder to write about
Of course.
the real feelings.
Did you write about the performances at the time, afterwards, or?
I was doing some writing on art when I met Peter, and I became a copywriter for advertising. I worked for a small agency, and I worked for some mail order catalogs, really, sort of schlock work. But actually, only many years later did I realize, when I was writing for mail order catalogs, I was given X number of words to describe something, and it's generally made me a pretty good editor of my work, so it was useful actually in the end. But I only sporadically wrote, starting in the 80s I was doing some stuff for Art Forum. I just never had a lot of time to write. I had my bookshop for many years, we had a family, all kinds of things. And that now I'm getting back to it and intensifying it. Thank you, Tara.
But did some of these artists start to request that Peter would be there, or they would want to know that he was going to be there to
Well,
shoot?
first of all, Peter was not the only person.
Yeah.
Okay. You have Robert McElroy, you had Al Geese. Later on, with the dancers, you had Nat Tileston, Robert Alexander, Babette Mangold. There were others, Tom Brazil, whatever, it goes on and on. But all the people who did it in the beginning, which were only the Al Geese, Bob McElroy, Peter, and Fred McDarrah, who was only working on assignment. And Fred came, he's a marvelous photographer, his archive is amazing, but he was working on consignment, and he was very disciplined, and so he didn't, he would take a certain number of pictures and he would leave. He wasn't always at the full performance even, sometimes. But, so except for Fred, who had a job, everybody else was doing it at their own time and expense, and because they thought it had to be preserved, and also they were all coming out of this Life magazine influence of what a photo essay was, or photojournalism was, and we're approaching it in a documentary, journalistic way. So what basically happened was, which is another thing I'm tracking or trying to track in the book, is that as you get into the late 70s, this is becoming professionalized, and that means that on one hand, the photographers might be paid, but on the other hand, the photographs are taken for very specific publicity uses, and then you even go further and the performances start being made for the camera.
Oh yeah, of course.
So there's progression there that change.
I mean, I was thinking more that Peter, that the certain artists understood his, affection and make sensibility as being maybe more integral to where the work was coming from than maybe some of the other
Well, it
photographers.
took a while for them to know his work, obviously. He worked very closely with Meredith, as I pointed out. That was, through the years, that became a professional and as well as a personal relationship, that she would request he come to photograph specifically. Yvonne and Peter did a collaboration. It was an idea of Yvonne's that Peter carried out, so it's a collaboration, which was a studio thing where 2 times in 1968 and 1970, he went into her studio and she had her dancers perform a sequence from The Mind is a Muscle, and Peter's, the camera was on a timer, and so the exposure was made at a certain interval with no control by him, basically. It was like a few minutes apart. And so you get a sort of very filmic sequence. But, those, he shot ambient light in all the pictures you've seen. And he had complete freedom to shoot what he wanted to. He always got permission, by the way, but he shot at his own initiative mostly.
Any other questions?
Barbara, what's the next lecture?
Uh-oh. I think this is my last one. It's a huge amount of work, and I want to do my writing. I sort of feel I've exhausted the slide medium for things I wanted to say.
Are these available somehow? Can we see ones that we weren't able to attend?
I'm sorry.
Is
what do you
it
mean?
possible to see any of the past lectures?
Andy, my videographer up there, Andy Gorian, thank you, Andy. I owe Andy a huge thanks. He's been videotaping. There were some lectures in the 90s that we didn't videotape. And actually, this was based on one from like the early 90s that because I didn't have it on videotape, I wanted to do a version of it. This is different, but I want to do a version of it. We're gradually putting them on YouTube.
Some are already up.
There are 4, I think, up. There are 3 that we have up, and the one I did, the Block Museum for the Charlotte Women's Show, is on there, available through their website. I think it's on video, not YouTube, I'm not sure, but you can find it.
Any more questions? Last chance. Well, thank you, Barbara.